The rain came down in sheets the night Ella Kingsley discovered that the man she had traveled 400 miles to marry had sold her to settle a gambling debt. She stood in the doorway of the Silver Spur Saloon in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, her traveling dress soaked through to her chemise, her brown hair plastered against her cheeks, her trunk sitting useless in 3 inches of mud behind her. She had stepped off the stage from San Antonio just 20 minutes ago, clutching the letter that Harlan Doyle had sent her, the letter that spoke of a fine ranch, a good life, a gentleman who needed a capable woman at his side. She had believed every word. She had sold her late father's tailoring shop in San Antonio to make this journey, and now she stood listening through a cracked window as Harlan Doyle, the man who had promised her that life, argued loudly with another man about whether she counted as collateral. "She's coming on the stage tonight," Harlan was saying, his voice thick with whiskey. "You'll have her signed over by morning, Cutter. That squares my debt, doesn't it?" The other voice, lower, oilier, belonging to a man she could not yet see, said something that made the men around the card table laugh. Ella's stomach turned to stone. She had not come this far, given up everything she had built from nothing since her father passed, to be traded like a horse at auction. She turned from the window, ignoring the way the mud sucked at her boots with every step, and she walked. She did not know where she was walking. She only knew she needed to be somewhere that was not here. The main street of Dusty Creek was barely a street at all. There was the saloon, a general store with its windows dark, a livery stable, a sheriff's office with a single lamp burning inside, and a scattering of houses and outbuildings beyond. The rain turned the street into a river of brown water, and the wind pushed against her like something alive. She made it perhaps 30 yards from the saloon before her boot caught on a submerged rock, and she went down hard on her hands and knees in the mud. She did not cry. She had not cried when her father died. She had not cried when she packed up everything she owned into one trunk and climbed onto a stage bound for a life she had only read about in a letter. She was not going to cry now, kneeling in the cold mud of a street in a town she did not know, in the dark, in the rain. She pressed her palms flat against the ground and pushed herself upward. A hand reached down from nowhere. She looked up and saw a man standing over her with a lantern held high enough to keep the rain from killing the flame. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a duster that was dark with rain, his hat pulled low. His face, in the lantern light, was angular and serious, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, dark eyes that were watching her with an expression that had no mockery in it at all. He looked like a man who had seen difficult things and had not been made cruel by them. "Easy now," he said, and his voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that did not rise even in the middle of a storm. He took her hand and helped her up from the mud with a firmness that made it clear he was not going to let her fall again. "You all right?" "I am perfectly fine," Ella said, which was an obvious lie given that she was coated in mud from her knees to her wrists and shaking with cold. The man did not argue with her. He simply held the lantern closer to her face for a moment, studying her with those dark eyes, and she had the strange feeling that he was cataloging something about her, not her appearance, but something else, something underneath. "You came in on the stage," he said. "It was not a question." "Yes. You're the woman Harlan Doyle sent for." The words landed between them with a particular weight, and Ella lifted her chin. "I was the woman Harlan Doyle sent for," she said carefully. "I am no longer certain that is a title I intend to keep." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name is Wallace Ramsey. I have a spread about 3 miles east of town. You need somewhere dry to stand while you figure out what comes next." Ella looked at him. In San Antonio she had been warned, repeatedly and with great feeling, about the dangers of trusting strangers in the territories. She was aware, in an abstract way, that accepting an invitation from a man she had known for 45 seconds was not the picture of prudence. She was also aware that she was standing in several inches of cold water with mud drying on her palms, that she had nowhere to sleep, and that the man who was supposed to provide her shelter had just tried to trade her like a coin. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Ramsey," she said. He picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing, tucked it under one arm, and held the lantern out to her so she could carry it. She took it without comment, and they walked together through the rain toward the livery stable at the end of the street. His horse was a big bay gelding named Copper, and the man loaded her trunk onto the saddle with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He did not make a show of helping her up, just offered his hand again, and she stepped into his interlaced fingers and swung up behind the saddle without assistance, settling herself sideways and holding the back of the cantle. She had ridden before. Her father had kept a mare. They rode out of Dusty Creek in the dark and the rain, and Ella held the lantern up and watched the road through the curtain of water, and she thought about the careful, foolish hope she had carried all the way from San Antonio. She had wanted a life. She had wanted something to build. She had believed a stranger's letter because she was 24 years old and her father was gone, and she had not known what else to believe. Wallace Ramsey did not speak during the ride. She was grateful for that. She was not yet ready to explain herself to anyone. The ranch house was small and honest, a timber frame building with a covered porch, a barn to the left, a corral beyond that held several horses. There were no grand flourishes to it, but the roof was sound and the windows had glass in them, and the porch did not sag. He brought the horse under the porch overhang before helping her down, and then he pushed the front door open and held it for her. Inside, there was a stone fireplace that held a bed of embers, a plank table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a shelf of books and tools, a rope bed behind a curtained partition. The floor was swept. There were dried herbs hanging from a ceiling beam and a coffee pot on the stove and a braided rug in front of the fire. It was not the fine ranch house Harlan Doyle's letter had promised, but it was clean, and it was warm, and it was real. Wallace knelt at the fireplace and fed the embers with kindling and then with split wood until the fire was going strong, and he did this without ceremony, like a man who kept his house because he lived in it and not because he expected company. Then he stood and put the coffee pot on the stove and turned to look at her. "There's a curtain," he said, gesturing toward the partition. "You can change your clothes. I'll leave a blanket out." Ella realized she was still holding the lantern. She set it down on the table. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, "why did you help me?" He considered that for a moment. "Because you were in the mud in the rain," he said, as though this were a complete and sufficient answer. "That is not a reason most men would have acted on." "Then most men and I don't agree." She studied him across the fire-lit room. He was perhaps 28 or 29, she thought, with the kind of weathered quality that came from working outdoors in all seasons, but his eyes, when she looked into them, were not old. There was something very awake about him. Alert and careful, and she searched for the word principled. He had the look of a man who had made certain decisions about who he intended to be and had not deviated from them. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with a depth that she did not have the words for yet. He nodded once and turned to the stove, and she took the blanket he had draped over the back of a chair and went behind the curtain to change into dry clothes. She lay awake for a long time that night on the rope bed, listening to the rain on the roof and the fire settling in the hearth, and she thought about what she was going to do. She had no home to return to in San Antonio. She had her trunk, her skills, she could sew anything, could manage a household, could keep books and cook and tend a garden and do a dozen other useful things. She had $12.40 left after the stage fare. She was 24 years old and she was alone in the Texas territory, and she was not, she told herself firmly, going to be afraid. In the morning the rain had stopped and the sky was the particular blue that comes after hard weather, clear and sharp and endless. Ella woke to the smell of coffee and frying salt pork, and found Wallace Ramsey at the stove with his back to her, moving with the unhurried ease of a man in his own space. He had already been out to the horses. She could tell by the mud on his boots and the dampness in his hair. "Morning," he said without turning. "Good morning." She came to the table and sat down, and he set a tin cup of coffee in front of her, and then a plate with salt pork and corn bread, and she ate with the hunger of someone who had not had a proper meal since the stage stop in Uvalde the day before. He ate across from her in silence, and she found that his silences were not uncomfortable. They were not the silence of a man who had nothing to say or who was ignoring her. They were the silence of a man who simply did not speak unless he had something worth saying. "I need to go into town today," she said when she had set down her fork. "I need to speak to the sheriff." Wallace looked at her over his coffee. "About Doyle." "About what I heard through the saloon window last night." She kept her voice even and direct, the way she had learned to speak to suppliers and customers who sometimes tried to take advantage of a young woman running a business alone. "He tried to sign me over to a man named Cutter to cover a gambling debt. I don't know what legal standing that has, but I intend to find out." Something shifted in Wallace's expression. Not surprise, more like recognition, as though he had suspected something along these lines. "Cutter is Vic Cutter," he said. "He runs the saloon and most of the gambling in this county. He has an arrangement with certain people that makes him difficult to move against." A pause, "But the sheriff, Tom Alderman, is an honest man. If you've got something to report, he'll hear it." "Do you know Harlan Doyle?" "I know of him. He's been in Dusty Creek about 2 years, runs a small cattle operation or claims to. Mostly he runs cards." Another pause, and she could see him deciding how much to say. "He brought in at least one other woman from a city last year, a Miss Porter from Galveston. She was gone inside of a week." Ella absorbed this. "Gone how?" "Gone back to Galveston, far as anyone knows." His eyes met hers and they were frank and serious. "I don't know what happened in between." She set her jaw. "Then I'll speak to Sheriff Alderman." "I'll ride with you," he said. She opened her mouth to tell him that was not necessary, and then she thought about Vic Cutter and the way the men in the saloon had laughed, and she said, "I would appreciate that." The town in daylight was modest and dusty, the streets still rutted from the night's rain. 3 horses were tied outside the general store, and a woman in a gray dress was sweeping her porch and watched them ride past with frank curiosity. Wallace touched the brim of his hat to her, and she nodded back. Ella filed away that he was known here and apparently respected, even if he was not the most talkative man in the county. Sheriff Tom Alderman was in his 50s, with a white mustache and a manner that was careful and deliberate. He listened to Ella's account of what she had heard through the saloon window without interrupting, and when she was finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at her with a kind of tired understanding. "Miss Kingsley," he said, "what you heard is not something I can prosecute, strictly speaking, because a man trading a woman like property is morally reprehensible, but the law in this territory is not as clearly written on the subject as it ought to be." He held up a hand when she drew breath to respond. "What I can do is go have a direct conversation with Harlan Doyle about whether any representation of marriage or partnership was made to you under false pretenses, because that I can act on. And I can make it very clear to Vic Cutter that Miss Ella Kingsley of San Antonio is under no legal or any other obligation to him, and that any attempt to enforce one will be treated as a criminal matter." It was not everything she wanted, but it was something. "Furthermore," Sheriff Alderman added, leaning forward and folding his hands on the desk, "I'd suggest you make yourself visible in this community. A woman alone is more vulnerable than a woman who's known. Get yourself established before anyone can try to treat you as if you don't exist." He glanced at Wallace. "She's staying at your place, Ramsey." "She needed somewhere safe last night," Wallace said. There was a certain carefulness in his voice, as though he were placing words precisely. "She can stay as long as she needs to while she gets herself sorted." Sheriff Alderman nodded, apparently satisfied that no impropriety was being suggested or intended. He looked at Ella again. "You have skills, trade." "I am a trained seamstress," Ella said. "My father was a master tailor in San Antonio. I worked with him for 6 years before his death. I can sew anything from a work shirt to a wedding dress." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, and he said, Dusty Creek has been badly in need of a seamstress since Martha Fenn moved to Austin. If you were to set yourself up here, you would not want for work." Ella had not considered that. She had come here expecting a husband and a household to manage. She had not come here intending to start over from nothing yet again. But she looked around at the honest, plain office, and she thought about the sky that morning, that particular fierce blue, and she thought about the way Wallace Ramsey had held out his hand in the mud without making anything of it, and something in her settled. "Then perhaps I will," she said. She and Wallace rode back to the ranch in the late morning, and the prairie on either side of the road was washed clean and bright, the grass very green after the rain, the mesquite and live oak catching the light. She had not truly looked at it last night. Now she looked and found it beautiful in a way that was different from anything she had known, vast and quiet and demanding nothing except that you be present in it. "Your ranch," she said. "How long have you had it?" "5 years," Wallace said. He rode well, easy and balanced, which told her he had been on horseback most of his life. "I came out from Missouri when I was 22. Worked 2 years on a cattle drive, saved what I could, bought the land from a man who was heading back east." "Do you work it alone?" "I have a hand who comes 3 days a week. Tom Briggs, good worker." He paused. "It's not a big operation. 20 head of cattle, some horses I train and sell. Enough to live on. More than enough if I work it right over the next few years." There was quiet ambition in the way he said it, not boasting, just a man describing his intentions. "What brought you to Missouri originally?" She was curious about him in a way that surprised her. He was not flashy or forward, was not trying to impress her. That absence of performance made her want to know more about what was actually there. "I was born there," he said, and there was something slightly careful in his answer, the way a man is careful about a subject that has complicated feelings attached to it. She did not push. They rode in silence for a while, a comfortable silence, and she noticed that Copper had a gentle mouth and that Wallace handled the reins with very light hands. She noticed that he knew the name of every bird that crossed the road, not because he made a point of telling her, but because she asked about a red-winged bird on a fence post, and he answered without hesitation, and seemed genuinely pleased to have been asked. Over the next week, Ella established herself in Dusty Creek with a practicality and energy that seemed to catch people slightly off guard, as though they had expected a woman in her position stranded, cheated, starting over, to be more diminished by it. She set up her sewing work out of a back room at the general store, whose owner, a stout and good-natured man named Bert Holloway, charged her a modest rent in exchange for the increased traffic her presence would bring to his shop. She had her sewing kit in her trunk, needles, thread in a dozen colors, a good pair of scissors, a measuring tape, and the small leather-bound book her father had kept all his pattern notes in. Within 3 days she had 4 commissions. A rancher's wife needed a dress let out at the seams for the 3rd time, and was embarrassed about asking, and was enormously relieved when Ella discussed it with the matter-of-fact warmth of a professional. A young couple was getting married in 6 weeks, and the bride wanted a dress made from a fabric she had been saving for 2 years, and had not trusted anyone in the county to cut correctly. 2 cowboys needed shirts repaired badly enough that they had ridden 8 miles to ask. And the schoolteacher, a thin young woman named Agnes Hale, needed 2 skirts and a blouse that were serviceable and well-made, because she had been mending the same garments for 2 years, and they were beyond mending now. Ella threw herself into the work with a gratitude she did not fully name. It was good to have her hands doing what they knew. It was good to be useful and needed and to be herself, not someone's prospective wife, not someone's transaction, just a woman with a skill that other people valued. She was staying at the ranch still, in the arrangement that had begun in the rain. She had offered to pay Wallace for the room, and he had declined in a way that was not dismissive, but seemed genuinely puzzled that she would frame it as a transaction. She cooked dinner most evenings, partly because it was her way of contributing and partly because she found she liked cooking for someone, liked the small ceremony of a shared meal at the end of a long day. They talked during those evenings. Not the way she had expected to talk with a man she barely knew, not carefully, not with performance, but the way two people talk when they are both too tired and too honest to bother with pretense. She told him about her father and the tailoring shop, about the years of working side by side with him, about the particular loneliness of closing a business that had been her father's whole life. He listened with a quality of attention that was rare and valuable, the kind that meant he actually heard what she said and held on to it. He told her about Missouri. Slowly, over several evenings, the fuller picture came, a father who had been hard and unloving in the particular way of men who consider their hardness to be a form of virtue, a mother who had been gentle and who had died when Wallace was 15, two younger brothers who had gone their own ways. The decision at 22 to go west and find out who he was when he was not being defined by someone else's idea of him. "Were you lonely?" she asked one evening when the fire was low and the coyotes were calling far off in the dark. He considered the question. "At first," he said, "less so as time went on. The work fills the days well enough." A pause, and he looked into the fire. "But there is a kind of loneliness that doesn't have anything to do with whether you are busy." She understood that completely, and she said so. It was on the 8th day that Harlan Doyle made his first mistake. Ella was at the general store fitting Agnes Hale for the first of her skirts when Doyle came through the door. He was a compact, fair-haired man in his middle 30s, with the kind of surface charm that worked well at a distance and degraded significantly up close. He looked at Ella with an expression that she could only describe as proprietary, as though her having left the situation he had arranged for her was a personal offense. "Miss Kingsley," he said, "I've been meaning to talk to you." "I am working, Mr. Doyle," she said, without looking up from Agnes's hem. "This won't take long. I want to explain the situation with Cutter. It's not what you think. There was a misunderstanding about the nature of the agreement, and I believe if you and I sat down, Mr. Doyle." She set down her pins and looked at him directly. "I heard what you said through the window of the Silver Spur on the night of the 14th. I have spoken with Sheriff Alderman, who has spoken with you, as I understand it. There is no sitting down. There is no misunderstanding to clarify. The answer is no, and it will continue to be no." Doyle's jaw tightened. His charm, such as it was, retreated to reveal something harder underneath. "You came out here with nothing," he said. "You don't have the luxury of." "I came out here with considerable skill, 2 good hands and 20 years of experience watching my father build something from nothing." Her voice was perfectly steady. "I am building something from nothing here as well, and I do not require your assistance or your explanations." "Good day, Mr. Doyle." Agnes Hale, who was standing very still with pins in her skirt, said nothing, but her eyes were shining with a particular light. Doyle left and Ella picked up her pins, and after a moment Agnes said quietly, "That was the bravest thing I have seen in 3 years of living in this town." Ella smiled, though it was a tired smile. "It was not bravery," she said. "It was practice." She told Wallace about it that evening over supper. He listened with his customary stillness, and when she finished she could see something working in his expression, something that was not quite anger but was related to it. Protective, she thought. Not the possessive protection of a man who wants to own something, but the kind that comes from genuine concern. "He won't let it alone," Wallace said. "Probably not," she agreed. "Men like Doyle rarely do. If he gives you trouble, I want to know about it." She looked at him across the table and felt something that was more than gratitude. There was a warmth to him that he did not advertise. It showed in the way he kept his house, in the way he handled his horses, in the way he had come out of the rain to hold out his hand to a woman he did not know. She was finding that she thought about him a great deal when they were not together, which was new and interesting and slightly alarming. "I will tell you," she said. And then, because she believed in saying true things, "You are a good man, Mr. Ramsey." He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved across his face that she could not quite name. "Wallace," he said. "You might as well call me Wallace." She smiled. "Then you should call me Ella." He said her name once, quietly, as though testing how it sat, and the way he said it made something in her chest go very still and then start up again slightly faster than before. 3 weeks passed in this way, and the shape of daily life on the ranch and in the town settled around her like something she had always known. She went to town 4 days a week and sewed in Bert Holloway's back room from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. She came home, and she noticed, not without some private amazement, that she had started thinking of the ranch as home, and she cooked while Wallace brought in the horses and checked the fences and did the 100 small tasks that maintaining a working ranch required. They ate together and talked and sometimes sat on the porch in the cooling evening and watched the stars come out, which happened here in a way that happened nowhere else she had ever been, with an intensity and abundance that made every night feel like a gift. She watched him with his horses and understood something about him that she had been trying to articulate. He had extraordinary patience. Not passive patience, not the patience of someone who has given up, but active patience, the kind that stays fully present and keeps coming back gently. She watched him work with a young horse that was nervous and skittish, and she saw him approach the animal 20 times over the course of an hour, each time calmly, never forcing, never withdrawing in frustration, until eventually the horse came to him. It was, she thought, the same quality he brought to his conversations with her. He never pushed. He was just always there. On the 22nd day, Vic Cutter himself came to the general store. Ella was alone in the back room, cutting fabric for the wedding dress, when she heard the front bell and then heard Bert Holloway's voice take on a certain cautious quality. She came to the door of the back room and saw Cutter for the first time. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps 50, with a broad, heavy face and pale eyes that had the quality of still water over deep mud. He was dressed too well for Dusty Creek, in a black coat and vest with a silver watch chain, and he moved through the store with the deliberate ease of a man who expected to occupy whatever space he entered. He saw her. His pale eyes moved over her with an assessment that was simultaneously colder and more offensive than anything Harlan Doyle had managed. "Miss Kingsley," he said pleasantly, "I've been hoping to make your acquaintance." "Mr. Cutter," she said. She stayed in the doorway. "You've been making quite a name for yourself in town," he said. "Hard worker, well liked. That's admirable." He paused. "I wanted to clarify something regarding an arrangement that was proposed to me by a mutual acquaintance. I want you to understand that my interest was entirely a business matter. Doyle owes me a considerable sum, and his, shall we say, creative approach to settling accounts put me in a position I had not sought." Another pause, still pleasant, still smooth. "I bear you no ill will, Miss Kingsley." Ella looked at him steadily. She was aware of the way he had phrased every sentence to position himself as a reasonable man discussing an unpleasant matter. She was also aware that behind the pleasantness there was something that was measuring her carefully. "I appreciate you saying so, Mr. Cutter," she said, matching his pleasant tone. "Then I trust we understand each other completely, and that this is the full extent of the matter." His smile did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened very slightly. "Naturally," he said. "I simply wanted to be certain there were no misunderstandings." He bought a box of matches from Bert and left. Bert came to the back room door and exhaled slowly. "That man scares me more than anyone in this county," he said quietly, "because he never raises his voice." "I know," Ella said. She looked down at the wedding fabric in her hands. Her own hands were perfectly steady, which surprised her a little. "I know." That evening she told Wallace, and this time the thing she saw in his expression was closer to anger, quiet and contained, but genuinely there. "He's sending a message," Wallace said. "He wants you to know he's aware of you." "I understand that." "Ella." He said her name differently than he had at first. There was a familiarity to it now, something warm in the way it came out. "I don't want to frighten you, but I want you to be careful. Cutter is a man who collects debts in ways that aren't always monetary. If Doyle can't pay him back in cash, then he might try to find another means of doing so." She finished the sentence because she was not afraid of the shape of the problem, only of Cutter himself. "I understand. I will be careful." "You're not alone in this," he said, and the way he said it was so direct and unhesitating that she had to look away for a moment. When she looked back at him, he was still watching her with that steady, awake regard, and she thought that she had never in her life had someone look at her quite the way Wallace Ramsey did, as though she were fully real, fully present, fully worth attending to. "I know," she said, and she meant it. The following Saturday was the first social event Dusty Creek had put on since the winter, a barn dance at the Holloway family's property on the edge of town, with a fiddle player and food, and the kind of communal gathering that small frontier towns depended on for their coherence. Bert had invited Ella with such genuine warmth that she had agreed before she fully thought it through, and then she had come home and told Wallace about it, and he had said, "I'll take you," in that simple, certain way of his, and that had been that. She wore the best dress she had brought from San Antonio, a dark blue cotton with small white buttons at the collar and cuffs, and she pinned her hair up and looked at herself in the small mirror by the washstand and found that she looked well. Not spectacular. She had never traded on spectacular, but present and alive and herself. Wallace was waiting by the porch when she came out, and he looked at her in a way that made the words he didn't say very loud. He had put on a clean shirt and his good coat, and he had made some effort with his hair, which she found quietly charming in a way she could not have explained. "You look nice," she said. "You look beautiful," he said, and then seemed very slightly surprised that he had said it aloud, and she was surprised too, but neither of them addressed the surprise, because it was simply true and they both knew it. The dance was everything a barn dance was supposed to be: loud and warm and full of fiddle music and lantern light, and the smell of hay and food, and the particular energy of people who had been working hard all week and were glad to laugh. Ella was introduced to a dozen people she had not yet met: the preacher and his wife, the doctor who traveled between 3 towns, several ranching families from outside town. She was welcomed with the directness of people who respected ability, and she found that her reputation as a skilled seamstress had preceded her in the best possible way. She danced twice with Bert Holloway, who was a terrible dancer and knew it and laughed freely about it, and once with a rancher named Patterson, who was very old and very formal and clearly delighted to have the opportunity. And then Wallace asked her, and she put her hand in his, and they moved into the pattern of a reel, and she found that he danced the way he did everything else, with careful, precise attention, with no wasted motion, and with a quality of genuine presence that made her feel as though she were the only person in the barn. They were, she became aware, being watched. Not with unkindness, with interest, the way a small community watches 2 people and thinks quietly to itself. She was aware of Agnes Hale's knowing eyes and Bert Holloway's warm smile, and she was aware above all of Wallace's hand at her waist and the fact that she did not want it to move. When the music ended, they stepped apart, and she was breathing slightly faster than the exertion entirely accounted for, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open and uncertain and very honest. "Ella," he started. Someone pulled him aside to ask about a horse trade, the way someone always does at exactly the wrong moment, and the conversation was interrupted, and she stood for a moment in the middle of the barn with the fiddle starting up again, and something warm and terrifying moving through her chest. On the ride back to the ranch, they were quieter than usual, a different kind of quiet from their ordinary comfortable silences. This quiet had a weight to it, an awareness of something that had been almost said and had not yet been resolved. She sat behind the saddle with her arms around him, which was how they always rode double, but she was very conscious of it now in a way she had not been before, the warmth of his back against her, the movement of him as Copper walked through the dark. "What were you going to say?" she asked quietly to the back of his head. He was silent for a moment. "I was going to say that I was glad you were here," he said. "In Dusty Creek, on the ranch." Another pause longer. "I was going to say that I know things began very strangely for you here, and that whatever comes next is your choice to make entirely, but that having you here has changed things." A pause. For me, changed things for me. She closed her eyes for a moment. The night was very soft, the stars enormous, the mesquite silver in the dark. How has it changed things? She asked. The house feels different, he said. Like it's actually a home now and not just a building I sleep in. His voice was careful and quiet, and she could hear him choosing words with the attention he brought to everything. I think about your opinion on things. I want to tell you things that happened during the day. I find I am considerably happier than I was before the 14th, which was a night I would have called a reasonably ordinary night at the time. He paused. I suppose that is a lot to say. It is not too much, she said. It is exactly right. He didn't say anything else, and she didn't either, but she kept her arms around him and felt him settle slightly under her hands, like a horse that has accepted the presence of someone it trusts. And she thought that perhaps what she had come west looking for had not been what she imagined at all, but had been here waiting in the rain with a lantern. The trouble with Vic Cutter came to a head on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, 6 weeks after Ella had arrived in Dusty Creek. She was closing up the back room at Holloway's, folding the completed wedding dress into tissue and putting the final pins into their case, when Bert came back from the street with a tightness around his eyes that she had learned to read as genuine concern. "There's word going around," he said, keeping his voice low. "Doyle has disappeared. Nobody's seen him in 4 days. His cattle have been sold, all 20 head, and the money is gone, which means he ran, most likely, rather than settle with Cutter." Ella set down the pin case. "And Cutter will look to settle the debt another way. He has been asking about you specifically," Bert said. "Tom Alderman told me this morning. Not threatening, not saying anything that Alderman can act on, just asking. Where does she live? What does she earn? Does she have family?" He looked at her with frank worry. "Ella, I think you should be careful going home today." She thought about this on the ride back to the ranch, on the horse Wallace had lent her for her daily commute, a steady gray mare named Fern who had no opinion about anything except grass. She thought about it carefully and practically, the way her father had taught her to think about problems. What did Cutter want? Money? How did he think he could get it from her? She was not sure, and that uncertainty was the real danger. A man who would trade a woman to settle a debt was a man who operated in a particular moral register, and she did not know how far down that register he was willing to go. Wallace was repairing a fence line near the corral when she rode in, and he looked up at the sound of Fern's hooves and then looked at her face and immediately set down his tools. She told him everything Bert had said, standing by the corral fence with Fern's reins loose in her hand, and she watched his jaw tighten and his eyes go very still, and thought that she would not want to be Vic Cutter in this moment. "I'm going to talk to Tom Alderman," he said. "He can't act on Cutter's asking questions," she said. "I know that, but I want Alderman to know what we know, and I want Cutter to know that Alderman knows." He looked at her. "And I am going to go see Cutter myself." "Wallace, not to cause trouble," he said, and his voice was so steady that she almost believed it was entirely true. "To make something clear." "What are you going to make clear?" He looked at her for a moment across the soft afternoon light, with the horses in the corral behind him and the wide country spread out in every direction, and he said, "That you are not part of any arrangement because you never were and you never will be, and that anyone who thinks differently is going to have a hard time of it." She looked at him and felt something profound and large move through her. "You don't have to do that for me," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said, with a simplicity that was somehow more powerful than anything elaborate would have been. They rode into town together the following morning, and Wallace went to the Silver Spur while she went to the general store, and she spent a very long 3 hours trying to concentrate on a hem while knowing he was across the street. She had made him promise not to do anything that would bring the law down on him, and he had agreed, and she trusted him, and she still spent those 3 hours very tense at her sewing. He came to the store at midday, and she looked up from her work and searched his face. "He'll leave you alone," Wallace said. "How did you?" "I said what needed to be said." And then, after a pause, I may have also mentioned that Tom Briggs and I and a couple of neighbors would be taking a very close interest in any business practices in this county that crossed certain lines, and that there are more of us than there are of the people who work for Cutter, and that we are all considerably more motivated. She stared at him. You organized the ranchers. I had some conversations this morning before I went to the saloon, he said, with a modesty that did not entirely conceal the fact that he had been quietly methodical about this. People in this county have had enough of Cutter's arrangement. They just needed someone to say it first. Agnes Hale, who happened to be in the store buying thread, looked up from the thread display and said, with great feeling, "Marry him, Ella." The color that came into Wallace's face at that moment was, Ella thought, one of the most charming things she had ever seen. She did not say anything in response to Agnes, because some things needed to happen in their own time and their own way. But she looked at Wallace across the counter with all of what she felt entirely visible in her expression, and he looked back at her with the same openness, and Agnes went back to her thread with a deeply satisfied air. The wedding dress commission was completed on the first Saturday of May and delivered with considerable ceremony to the bride, a girl named Clara Webb who put it on in her mother's bedroom and came out transformed. Her mother cried. Ella pinned the final alterations with a steady hand and thought about what it meant to make something that people would carry into the most important moments of their lives. Clara's mother pressed her hand afterward and said, "You are a genuine artist, Miss Kingsley. I hope you know that." Ella thought about her father and his leather-bound book of patterns, and she said, "I had a good teacher." Clara's wedding was on the second Saturday of May, in the little whitewashed church at the end of Dusty Creek's Main Street, with half the county in attendance and the fiddle player from the barn dance playing something beautiful at the entrance. Ella sat in a pew near the back and watched the ceremony and let herself feel, for once, simply happy. Not the careful, complicated happiness of someone who is watching for danger, but straightforward, uncomplicated happiness for two young people beginning something. Wallace sat beside her. At some point during the ceremony his hand found hers in the space between them on the pew, and she did not look at him, and he did not look at her, but she turned her hand over and his fingers closed around hers, and they stayed that way through the rest of the vows. It was the following Sunday that the rains came back, heavy and prolonged, and it rained for 2 days straight, and the road to town turned to impassable mud, and Ella and Wallace were effectively confined to the ranch and each other's company. She did not find this any hardship at all. She had brought her mending, and he had brought in more firewood than strictly necessary, and they sat on either side of the fireplace for 2 days, reading and working and talking, and she learned things about him in those 2 days that she had not known yet. She learned that he read history and found it genuinely engrossing, that he had strong opinions about land management and soil quality, that he had a dry humor that came out most often when he was relaxed, and that she found absolutely delightful, that he could make coffee extraordinarily well, and that he had once, years ago on the cattle drive, learned to play a harmonica and was still marginally competent at it. She persuaded him to play for her on the second rain-soaked evening, and he played something slow and melancholy that she did not know the name of, and it was not technically perfect, but it was honest, and she sat across from him with her mending in her lap, and thought that this, specifically this ordinary, extraordinary evening by the fire, was what she had been trying to find when she got on the stage in San Antonio. On the evening of the second day, when the rain had softened to a steady murmur on the roof, he put the harmonica down and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the fire crackled between them, and there was something in the room that had been building for weeks and was now very close to the surface. "Ella," he said. His voice was quiet and direct, the way he always was when he was saying something that mattered. "I need to say something to you." "Say it," she said. "I am in love with you." He said it simply, without preamble, without decoration. "I have been for some time, I think, and I want you to know it because I believe in saying true things." He paused. "I don't want to complicate your life. I know you came here under circumstances that were not of your making, and I know you've been building something here that is entirely your own, and I'm not asking you to change any of that. I'm only asking that you know how I feel, because keeping it to myself has become increasingly difficult." She looked at him across the fire for a long moment. Outside, the rain was soft and steady. Inside, the room was warm and lit by the fire, and he was looking at her with those dark, awake eyes, completely open, completely present. And she thought about the first night and the lantern in the rain and the hand held out in the mud and all the evenings since and the hand in the pew and the horse he had lent her and the way he said her name. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time as well." She smiled slightly. "I believe in saying true things." Something in his face changed completely. Not as though he had been hiding pain exactly, but as though something had been held at a careful distance and was now allowed to come close. He exhaled slowly, and then he smiled, and it was the most open and unguarded smile she had ever seen on his face, and it made him look young and entirely himself. "That is very good news," he said. She laughed, and the laugh came out warm and real, and he laughed too, and it was nothing like the careful, managed laughter of people trying to impress each other. It was the laughter of two people who have just told each other the truth and are enormously relieved. He came around the fireplace and sat beside her on the bench where she had her mending, and he took her hand with the same directness he brought to everything. And they sat together while the rain came down and the fire burned low, and she put her head on his shoulder, which felt entirely right, and he rested his cheek against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said. She thought about Harlan Doyle's letter, which she had read 20 times on the stage from San Antonio, which had promised her a life in the territory, and had delivered something so much better and so much more real than anything the letter had described. She thought about how strange and unlikely it was, and how grateful she was for the rain, for the mud, for the moment she had gone down on her knees in the dark street, for the lantern that had appeared above her like something inevitable. June arrived in a blaze of heat and color, and Ella had been in Dusty Creek for 3 months, and the life she was building had taken on a solid reality that she could feel in every part of her day. Her sewing business was thriving beyond anything she had initially hoped. She had more commissions than she could comfortably handle alone, which was a very good problem, and she had begun to think about whether she might eventually find premises of her own, not Bert Holloway's back room, but an actual shop, with a proper sign and a fitting area with a real mirror. She had also begun to quietly take on other work. The schoolteacher Agnes Hale had mentioned that the school needed repairs, and Ella had mentioned this to Wallace, who had organized a working party on a Saturday and fixed the roof and the windows and built new benches, and she had fed everyone lunch afterward. Small things, but they added up, and she felt the addition of them. She and Wallace were together now with a clarity and certainty that required no performance. They were simply together, as naturally as the ranch and the land were together, and the people of Dusty Creek had absorbed this fact into their understanding of the town without fanfare. One morning in late June, Wallace saddled 2 horses before dawn and woke her and said, "Come and see something." She dressed quickly and came out to find the sky in the east beginning to lighten, the air cool and sweet with night still in it, and they rode east for 20 minutes until they came to the top of a long, low rise, and she saw the sun come up over the flat country below in a great spreading fire of orange and gold, turning every rock and tree and blade of grass into something illuminated, and she sat on Fern and felt the heat of it hit her face and could not speak. "I come here sometimes," he said, "when I need to remember what all the work is for." She looked at him in the morning light, his profile against that enormous sky, and thought that she had never loved anyone so much in her life. "Wallace," she said, "yes. I want to stay here. I mean here in Dusty Creek on this ranch with you. I want to stay." He looked at her and the light was in his eyes. "Is that a question?" "No," she said. "It's a statement. I just wanted to say it out loud." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they sat on the rise together and watched the sun climb, and the land went from gold to ordinary bright morning around them, and it was one of the best mornings of her life. He asked her to marry him in August, with no more fanfare than the way he did everything, which was to say directly and completely and without artifice. They were in the garden she had planted behind the house, which was doing better than she had expected given the heat and the dry months. She had coaxed tomatoes and beans and a small herb plot from the ground with a stubbornness her father would have recognized, and he came out from the barn where he had been working and said, simply, "Ella, will you marry me?" She was kneeling in the garden, her hands in the earth, and she sat back on her heels and looked up at him standing in the afternoon light, tall and certain and entirely himself. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. He reached down and pulled her up and held her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, warm and careful and real, with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything he cared about. And she thought about all the stories she had ever read about the West being a rough and empty place, and found them entirely inadequate. He had his father's ring, which his mother had given him the night before she died, and which he had carried in his coat pocket since Missouri. It was a simple band of gold, not fancy, and it fit her finger as though it had been made for her, which she chose to take as a sign. They were married in September, in the same whitewashed church at the end of the main street, with Agnes Hale and Bert Holloway and Sheriff Tom Alderman and Clara Webb and her new husband and a substantial portion of Dusty Creek in attendance. Agnes cried. Bert cried. Wallace did not cry, but his voice was slightly rough when he said the vows, which she found more moving than tears would have been. Ella wore a dress she had made herself, from a fabric that was the deep blue of the Texas night sky, and she had embroidered the cuffs in a pattern her father had drawn in his book years ago. She was marrying not because she had to, not because she had no other options, but because she wanted to with her whole free will, because this was the man, and this was the place, and this was the life. She said her vows in a clear and steady voice, and felt the rightness of it settle into her like the earth receiving rain. Afterward there was dancing in the Holloway's barn again, and they danced together until the fiddle player's arm gave out, and Wallace held her close in the last slow dance with the lanterns burning low and said, very quietly, close to her ear, "I am very glad you got on that stage in San Antonio." "I am very glad you had a lantern," she said. In the autumn, Wallace expanded the ranch's horse training operation with a seriousness of purpose that impressed even the most skeptical of his neighbors. He had a gift for it. She had always seen this, and his reputation for producing well-trained horses spread to ranches and operations 20 and 30 miles distant. He took on Tom Briggs full-time and hired a second hand, a young man named Felipe Vega who was 17 and had come up from south of the border and who worked with the same patience and skill that Wallace brought to his own work. Ella opened her shop in October. She rented the storefront that had been empty next to the general store, and Wallace and Tom Briggs and Felipe spent a weekend installing shelves and a proper cutting table and a fitting mirror she ordered from San Antonio. Agnes Hale painted the sign, Kingsley Ramsey, dry goods and dressmaking. Ella had kept her professional name alongside his because her work was known under it, and Wallace had not merely accepted this but had suggested it, which she took as further evidence of what she had already thoroughly established, which was that she had married the right person. The shop opened on a Monday morning in October to a line of 7 customers waiting outside the door, which made her laugh with a combination of joy and slight panic. By the end of the first week, she had confirmed that she needed at least part-time help, and she hired a local woman named Rosa Medrano, who had excellent sewing skills and had been doing piecework from her home for years without adequate recognition or compensation. Rosa proved to be not only a skilled seamstress, but a quick and accurate reader of what customers actually wanted as opposed to what they said they wanted, which was a different and equally important skill. Ella was 25 now, nearly 26, and her life was full in every direction. The shop, the ranch, Wallace, the community she had become genuinely part of. She had not expected this. She had expected a practical arrangement, a workable life. What she had was something larger and warmer and more surprising than that. In the spring following their marriage, she discovered she was expecting their first child, and she told Wallace on a Tuesday evening after supper, and he went very still for a moment and then looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so full that she felt it like something physical. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly certain," she said. "Mrs. Patterson came in last week about her daughter's situation and described the signs with considerable specificity." He laughed at that, and then he crossed the room and held her, and she felt his heartbeat, which was slightly faster than usual, against her cheek. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "Yes," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "Also the happiest I have ever been in my life, including the day you said yes." "That is exactly how I feel," she said. She managed the shop through the spring and into the summer, slowing down gradually as the months progressed, handing more and more of the daily management to Rosa, who proved fully capable of it. Wallace would not let her ride Fern after the 4th month, which she found slightly overly cautious. But she did not push the argument because she could see what it cost him to maintain his ordinary calm equanimity on the subject of her safety. Their son was born in early October, exactly 1 year after the shop opened, delivered by the traveling doctor and the considerable practical competence of Agnes Hale, who turned out to have delivered several babies before and was brisk and excellent about the whole process. He was a sturdy, dark-haired boy who arrived with an expression of such serious intentness that Wallace, when he held him for the first time, looked at Ella and said, "He already has opinions." "He takes after you," she said, exhausted and exhilarated and absolutely certain of it. They named him James Henry Ramsey James for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Henry for her father, which made her cry. The first time she had cried in a very long time, good clean tears that she was not ashamed of. Wallace held the baby and looked at him with such complete wonder that Ella found herself watching him as much as the child, and she thought about the man in the rain with the lantern, and she thought that the river of causation that had brought her here, the grief, the bad letter, the stage ride, the mud, was the strangest and most exact path she could imagine, and she was grateful for every step of it. James Henry grew with the ranch and the town, both of which also grew. By the time he was old enough to walk with confidence, he had a firm opinion about every horse in the corral and an already established tendency to be quiet and observant in the way of his father. Ella saw herself in the stubbornness, and Wallace with great fairness pointed this out on a regular basis. Dusty Creek itself changed over those years. More families came. The school that Agnes Hale ran expanded and eventually acquired a second teacher. The general store became 2 stores. A doctor settled permanently. There was talk of a proper railway connection within a decade. The town was becoming something solid and intentional, the way towns did when the people in them decided they were staying. Vic Cutter's hold on the county's darker transactions diminished considerably over the same period. This was partly due to Wallace's organized resistance, and partly due to Tom Alderman's persistent and methodical attention to legal means, and partly due to the simple fact that communities that grow and fill with families have less tolerance for the kind of operations Cutter ran. By 1885, Cutter had relocated to another town, and the Silver Spur was under new management, and the particular arrangement that had nearly ensnared Ella on the night of her arrival was a memory that nobody mentioned with anything but contempt. Harlan Doyle was never seen in Dusty Creek again. Sheriff Alderman heard at some point that he had turned up in a town in New Mexico under a different name, and then that story went cold, and no one spent much energy pursuing it. In the late spring of 1886, Ella found herself walking through the shop early one morning before Rosa arrived, touching the bolts of fabric on the shelves. the measuring tape hanging on its hook, the neat row of spools arranged by color on the upper shelf. The morning light came through the window in long bars and turned the fabric's extraordinary colors, and she could hear, distantly, the sounds of the street waking up in the ranch at the edge of her hearing, the horses, the particular quality of a world she knew completely and had made her own. She was 28 years old. Her son was 18 months old and had this week added 4 new words to his vocabulary, all of which he was deploying with great enthusiasm. Her shop was profitable and full of things she had built from nothing. Her husband was the best person she knew, which she had thought from almost the beginning, and which daily life had only continued to confirm. She thought about the woman she had been on the stage from San Antonio, hopeful and afraid and practical and foolish, and full of a desire for life that she had not known how to satisfy. She thought about that woman getting off the stage in the rain and walking away from the saloon window and going down in the mud. She thought about a hand appearing out of the dark. She reached out and touched the bolt of dark blue fabric. There was always dark blue fabric. She kept it stocked as a matter of principle, and she thought, I found what I was looking for. Not what I thought I was looking for. What I was actually looking for. She realized, very happy. Not the careful, held-breath happiness of someone waiting for it to be taken away, but the settled, rooted, daily happiness of someone who has built something real on solid ground. The shop bell rang. Rosa came in, taking off her hat, saying good morning, asking about James's new words and laughing when Ella told her, beginning her morning routine with the same warm competence she brought every day. Ella put on her apron. She had 3 commissions to finish this week. A christening gown for the doctor's new daughter, a suit jacket for the new schoolteacher who was coming from Houston, a dress for Clara Webb's mother, who was celebrating her 60th birthday with a gathering of her family. She went to her cutting table and picked up her scissors, and the light moved through the window, and the town outside was alive with morning, and she thought that precisely this, was enough. More than enough. More than she had known to ask for. Wallace came to the shop at noon, which he did on Tuesdays and Fridays, to bring her lunch, which was a habit that had begun in the first weeks of their marriage and had never been discontinued. He came in now with a wrapped cloth that held corn bread and cold chicken and a jar of tea, and he set it on the corner of the cutting table and looked at her with the same expression she had been seeing on his face for 4 years, which had not diminished or become familiar in the way of things that are taken for granted. He still looked at her as though she were the most interesting thing in the room. James threw his breakfast at the wall this morning, he said, sitting down in the customer's chair. How far did it get? Impressive range, he said. I believe he has a future in something athletic. She laughed and unwrapped the lunch, and they ate together in the shop, Rosa having gone home for her own midday meal, and the street outside moved through its Tuesday business. And they talked about ordinary things, the fence that needed attention on the north pasture, the commission in Houston that wanted 3 horses trained and delivered, the question of whether James was old enough for a dog, which was a debate they had been having for 6 weeks. He is 18 months old, Wallace said. I had a dog at 18 months. You also ate mud at 18 months, as you have described on several occasions. That doesn't mean James should. A good dog is Ella. A boy and a dog on a ranch is practically a requirement. Find me a good dog, she said, and we will discuss it. He found a good dog within the week. It was a young border collie, black and white and energetic, that belonged to a ranching family 20 miles away and was the pick of a litter of 8. He brought it home wrapped in his coat on a Saturday morning and set it on the kitchen floor, and James, who happened to be sitting on the braided rug near the fireplace, looked at it with the absolute focused attention of someone encountering something of profound significance. The dog walked over and sat down in front of James and looked at him. James reached out and patted it on the nose very carefully, with the seriousness of a scientist performing an experiment. There, Wallace said from the doorway. There, Ella agreed. They named the dog Cooper at James's indication. He could not say Cooper yet, but he said something that sounded enough like it for everyone present to agree, and Rosa, who was there for the occasion, confirmed that it was clearly Cooper, and that was that. The summer of 1886 was long and golden and full. The horse training operation brought in more money than they had projected, and Wallace hired a third hand. The shop had a waiting list for the first time, which was a very good kind of problem. James took his first unassisted steps in late July, crossing the kitchen floor to get to Cooper, which meant that the dog's first real contribution to the household was motivating the child to walk. In the evenings, when James was asleep and Cooper was lying by the door and the heat of the day had softened to the cool of the Texas night, Ella and Wallace sat on the porch the way they always had, and she looked at the stars and thought about the years it had taken her to get here and found every single one of them entirely worth it. One evening in August, when the sky was very clear and the coyotes were far off and the ranch was quiet, Wallace said, "I want to build you something." She looked at him. "What kind of something?" "A bigger workroom," he said. "At the back of the shop you need more space. You've needed it for a year and you haven't complained about it once. I have Rosa now." "You need more space than Rosa," he said. "You have a waiting list. You could take on another seamstress if you had room for 2 cutting tables." He paused, and she could see he had been thinking about this for some time. "Your father built his business from nothing. You built yours from nothing in a strange town with $12. I want to help you build the next part, if you'll let me." She looked at him in the porch light. This man she had known for 4 years and loved for nearly as long. This man who kept finding ways to be better and more generous than she already expected. And she said, "I will let you." He built it himself on the weekends over September and October, with Tom Briggs helping and Felipe lending his considerable and underappreciated carpentry skills. And by the time the weather turned cold, the new workroom was finished. Twice the size of the original back room, with 2 large windows for light and built-in shelving, and a second cutting table, and a small iron stove for the cold months. She stood in it on the day it was completed and turned around slowly and touched the shelves and looked at the light coming through the windows and felt her father's presence very strongly, the way she sometimes did when she was doing something she knew he would have been proud of. "Thank you," she said to Wallace, who was standing in the doorway with sawdust still on his coat. "Thank your father," he said. "He taught you to love the work." She looked at him and thought that this was possibly the most exactly right thing he had ever said, which was saying something because he had said many exactly right things. She hired a second seamstress in November, a quiet young woman named Maria Okonkwo, who had come to Dusty Creek with her husband, a carpenter who was working on several of the new buildings going up as the town continued its expansion. Maria was skilled and quick, and had a talent for decorative embroidery that was genuinely exceptional, and within 3 months she had brought in several additional commissions specifically because of that skill. The shop had become something her father would have recognized. Not just a place of work, but a place in the community, where women came not only for practical clothing, but for the kind of conversation that happens in women's spaces, honest and particular and real. She thought about her father's shop in San Antonio, the way it had been a meeting place as much as a business, and she understood now that this was not incidental to good work, but essential to it. She was sitting in the shop on a December evening after hours, finishing the last of a winter coat commission by lamplight, when Rosa came in from an errand and set a letter on the cutting table. "Came this afternoon," Rosa said. "Postmark from San Antonio." Ella looked at it. The handwriting on the front was her aunt's, her father's sister, her last remaining family, and she opened it with the scissors she had in her hand. Her aunt was well, the letter said. Her aunt's son had married. There was news of the old neighborhood, the buildings going up and coming down, the changes in the city. And then, near the end, in her aunt's careful, old-fashioned script, "Your father's shop has been bought by a nice family, and they have kept it as a tailor shop still. I went past last week and stood in front and thought of him. I think he would have been very glad to know you found your place." Ella set the letter down on the cutting table and looked at it for a moment. She thought about her father. She thought about the shop in San Antonio and the leather-bound pattern book, which was here in the drawer of her own cutting table. She thought about everything it had taken to get from there to here, all the grief and the foolishness and the courage and the luck, and the exact moment a man had held out his hand in the rain. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her apron pocket and picked up the coat she had been sewing, and she finished the last seam by lamplight, and her stitches were perfect, and even and her hands were entirely steady, and she was grateful. She walked home in the dark, which she always did safely because the town knew her and she knew it. The street was quiet and cold, stars very bright above the rooftops. She could see the light in the ranch house window from the edge of town, a warm yellow rectangle against the dark. She walked toward it. Wallace was inside, reading by the fire, James asleep behind the curtain partition. They had built a proper second room by now, but James still chose the curtained corner when he was tired, having established his preferences early. Cooper was stretched across the rug. The room was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular domestic comfort of a house that is deeply lived in. Wallace looked up when she came in. His face in the firelight was exactly what it always was, open and awake, and regarding her with that quality of full attention that had distinguished him from the very first night. "Late tonight," he said. "I wanted to finish the Merritt coat." She hung up her cloak and came to sit beside him on the bench by the fire. "I had a letter from my aunt." He put his book down. "Good news, she said." She told him what her aunt had written, and he listened with the attention he always brought, and when she was finished he put his arm around her and she leaned into him and looked at the fire. "Your father would have liked this place," Wallace said. "He would have liked you," she said. "Enormously. He had very good judgment about people." "I believe he had excellent judgment," Wallace said, "given what he produced." She laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the room and the steadiness of him settle around her like something completely safe. Outside, the December wind moved across the Texas plains and the stars burned hard and cold above the dark land. And inside the fire was warm and her husband's arm was around her and her son was sleeping behind the curtain and Cooper's tail moved once against the floor as though he knew something good was in the room. She thought about all of it. The stage from San Antonio, the rain, the mud, the lantern, the hand. She thought, this is what it means to arrive somewhere. She thought, I am home. She pressed her palm flat against Wallace's chest, over his heart, feeling it beat. He covered her hand with his, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying, because they were two people who had found the real and extraordinary life hidden inside an ordinary rainy night in a small town at the edge of a vast country, and they had built it together with their own hands and kept it with their own care, and it was enough, and it was real, and it was theirs. James woke in the morning before them, as he always did, and they heard him talking to Cooper with the earnest conversational quality he brought to the dog, who listened with great apparent interest, and they lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet and listened to their son's voice and the dog's responding sounds, and Ella felt Wallace's hand find hers under the blankets, and she thought that somewhere in the city her father's shop stood under new hands but the same purpose. And somewhere on the plains, the mesquite and the live oak were standing in the cold morning, and out in the corral the horses were stirring, and the world was carrying on in the way the world does, full and continuing and large. And she was part of it in every way that mattered. She squeezed Wallace's hand. He squeezed back. From the other room, James made a sound of pure delight about something the dog had done, and Cooper barked once, short and happy, and the morning light came slowly through the window and found everything it needed to find the braided rug, the fireplace, the table where they ate their meals, the shelf where her father's pattern book sat next to Wallace's histories, the apron on its hook, the wedding ring on her finger, and made of all of it something that was golden and solid and entirely, permanently immovably real.